And I will unmute my microphone and start again. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Findmypast at Home. Today, we have a session on how to use family history records for your queer history research. And we're going to be joined today by Dr. Justin Bengry. Justin is the head of Goldsmiths University Queer History Master's Program, and he's been there since 2017. And he is also the new director of the Center for Queer History at Goldsmiths University as well. So, and Justin, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Mary. Thanks so much for having me.
Great. So let's just dive right in. Just for anybody watching, we are live and we have our fantastic Findmypast support team watching the comments. So if you have any questions or anything, any topics even you want us to dive into, please put it into the comments section. And if we get time, we'll definitely get into that. So while we're waiting for anybody else to jump in, Justin, I guess, do you want to start talking through about how family history records has enhanced or given the opportunity for your own research?
Sure. Well, I suppose with queer history research, people don't always think that family history records would be such a useful source, or might not think of them as like an initial go-to place to learn about queer history for a whole variety of reasons around the way families are constructed, around legal recognition of people, the types of records we have access to, who's invisibilized in historical records, and all of these are fair concerns. And I think we have to take them into consideration when we're looking at any records to better understand the queer past. And so I probably started from that point myself as well. And a lot of my previous research was using newspapers, magazines, archival documents in the traditional archive, personal papers, what have you, government documents, legislation, that kind of thing. And so I'm always trying to remind my students too that there's a whole range of sources that they might think about using in addition to these traditional historical sources. And ultimately what it comes down to is if you're interested in learning about people, that includes queer people, and queer people have left records of their lives and relationships in really interesting ways as well. And thinking about how to access the lives of LGBTQ people in the past, we can approach family history records with, I suppose, a few of these issues in mind. It's not going to be as straightforward as finding when did grandma marry grandpa kind of thing, or where are their christening records. But that's not to say that those exact records aren't also useful for doing history, because LGBTQ people in the past, they came from families, they built families. These aren't just what we talk about today in terms of families of choice, but they have biological families that leave records as well. We have to bear in mind that those records tell us different things or may hide certain things in the case of queer people, but that doesn't mean that queer people are non-existent in those records. It's also the case, of course, that particularly for gay men and lesbians before the recent past, they often did get married, and they got married to opposite sex partners. And so there are records of those relationships that tell us something about what it was like to be queer in the past, when perhaps you were married because that was what was expected of you, or because economic necessities required you to be married, or because you genuinely loved your partner, in addition to being attracted to members of the same sex as well. So there's all kinds of things to bear in mind that family history records and sources and stories tell us about the queer past as well.
There's so many things in there that we can jump into. I'm just making so many notes. I think one of the key things that you said at the beginning there was the range of records as well. I think it's so important to remember to just look beyond of just you're looking for the birth, marriage, and death. Look at everything else that's going on. And you also mentioned legislation. I think because particularly us, we have kind of a history background. I think I always like to put it forward that it's really important to put your ancestors in a social context as well, understand what it is, what was happening at that time, what is the legislation, for homosexual men, but also what is the legislation around, it's the same for women in marriage, what are their rights in marriage, and understanding these kind of laws also creates more of awareness on what life was like for your ancestor as well. And I think one thing that you really touched on there too is that even though, these people are in our family tree, doesn't mean, because there was a marriage as such, doesn't always mean that they, they might not have been gay or bisexual as well. So, we can't always discount that. And I think this gives us an opportunity to tell a much fuller life experience of the people within our trees. And also, it's really exciting to trace your family tree, not just looking at like your very, your direct line, your grandparents to your great grandparents and straight up. Look at the aunts and uncles and the nieces and nephews and all of those people. And because they were, a big part of your ancestor's life, of your great grandfather's life, his uncle might, his brother would have been his best friend, so get to know what his story was a bit more too. And you might find out a lot more and a much fuller understanding of what family was like. I think just talking about family trees, Justin, I was wondering, I know you've spoken to me in the past about how you've actually used the family tree features to help build your own research and also to even just keep track of research as well.
Absolutely, I found that really useful on the family history platforms to start. It's almost like creating the biography of that person's life and using this platform as a research tool. And I found that really useful. I've got multiple trees in place for different projects or different people that are involved in them, and I start to find out about them. I often need to find out who their siblings are, who their parents are, who's connected to them in different ways, because I start to see those names coming up, and I don't understand who they are and what the relationship to them is without having this tree in place. I do end up then with a funny situation that I'm getting actually from, I think it is from Findmypast right now. I'm getting emails saying, we have a hint, we think you're related to this person. I'm like, well, I'm not really related to them, but thank you anyway. And actually the hints have been great, because then it brings in other sources that I might not fully have considered. And you discussed the range of sources earlier, and I think it's imperative that we recognize that all of the sources that are relevant to understanding our family's past, and for anybody, are relevant to understanding queer people's past. So those birth, marriage, death certificates, those are all important for understanding the queer past, and so is absolutely everything else. I can't actually think of any source that would be on a family history site, archive, whatnot. I can't think of any source that doesn't intrigue me in terms of queer history and doesn't offer something useful or interesting, even if it's just to confirm and cross-reference. That's knowing where a person was at a particular moment in time, their physical proximity to other people. All of these things have been really useful to me as I'm building up projects using these types of sources. I just see on the in some of the comments that Brian has said that his husband is on his family tree, and I think this is actually a wonderful thing going forward. That in the past we've got, of course, family trees that show heterosexual relationships, and I'm delighted that this can accommodate same-sex marriages and relationships now going forward, because of course that's going to be the reality of family history research going forward. I might want to know the histories of my two dads' families or my two moms' families, or my or blended, all kind, like I know people that are in families with multiple parents, because it's a family created deliberately with combinations of couples. And I think what's amazing about trees is that they'll be able to accommodate that variety going forward, and be more honest about people's origins.
Absolutely. I think it's great. The family history software is catching up to more modern families. Just like Brian, I have my wife on my family tree, and, I can do that on the Findmypast family tree. The settings are no longer, so strict that it's only man and a woman that's married. You can change the gender, or you can, move those characteristics around to reflect real life now. So I think that's great to say about technology coming forward and becoming more modern. I also have to say, Justin, you mentioned about the hints, and I would be a poor Findmypast staff member if I don't mention that we actually rolled out private messaging now on our tree. So when you receive a tree-to-tree hint, you can reach out to those other people, and we've rolled that out across all of our territories. So it doesn't matter if you have a tree in Australia or in the UK, you can reach out to people. I think this might be a best time. Maybe do you want to jump in and we'll actually start showing some of the research that you have looked at and show how you've used these records?
Sure, absolutely. So the cases that I've brought up. So I'll give a little bit of background. I came across a absolutely fascinating case of a man charged for homosexual offenses in the 1930s, and it's a really, really rich case, much more rich than I expected. And rarely do these include testimony and transcripts, but this one has multiple testimonies because people would be re-interviewed saying, oh, I lied the first time, here's the real story, or so-and-so told me to say this and now I'm saying that. So it's just this incredibly rich story of one case that really caught my attention, that I've been working with for a few years. And so I started actually tracing the people who are named in this file from the 30s. And in the process of that, actually, this is where I really got interested in using family history research methods and sources, was because I found the family of the man involved. And through, actually, it was, I can't remember which platform it was, but through someone posting a similar story, I reached out to them and said, oh, I'm researching that person as well. I'm not related, but I'm a researcher, a historian. And she wasn't, but it was a friend of hers. And I've now had a multi-year friendship, I'd say, with the family of this man who was charged and found innocent of homosexual offenses in the 1930s. But in the process...
I was just going to say, that's amazing how, like, you know, just from historical research and through connecting on these different channels to create now new friendships, because you've this linked person, even though he's not in your tree, but you have this linked, you know, similar interest.
Oh, absolutely. And I've visited him at his home a couple times now. He's the step grandson of the man that I'm researching, and has shared all of the non-public records, all of the family letters, photographs, everything. And we've been together piecing together the story of his step grandfather's life. And it's just been such a warm and friendly relationship. In fact, I've had an email exchange with him again over the last couple of days as I was preparing for this for our conversation. But so in the process of that, to think about the sources, there was the man whose family I'm in contact with, who was an older man charged with offenses with a younger man. And I want to learn more about, you spoke about context earlier, and the newspaper sources give so much incredible context, because I was like I was saying, there's a lot of the legal documentation of court cases that doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed. It was never saved. It was not meant to be archived in full. And so very often the newspapers provide the richest source on trials that exists in the past. And so in the process of looking up the name of the younger man, who's identified here at the top of the newspaper article, Sidney Jack Chapman, I found this newspaper article that actually opened up an incredible story, because this was another case where he was charged. This Chapman young man was charged with, I think it was a blackmail offense. And it doesn't necessarily say here that it was for homosexual offenses, but they hide the name of the plaintiff. He's referred to as Mr. X. And it's everything throughout the story basically suggests this is a homosexual offense. I did find more records on this, and it was. So what I learned was that in addition to the case that I found in the National Archives, about the same time, one of the participants in that case was also charged with another similar offense. And so I was able to start tracing the context in which he was interacting in the story that I was researching, and finding out that actually there's a whole network of stories and people going out from there. I've since, through archival records, found out who Mr. X is. I'm starting to research his family and see if I can contact them in the same way, and find out more about that case. Of course, as a queer historian, I want to know if Mr. X is actually queer. If he I want to know his story. Is he innocent and falsely accused? Is he caught up in something that he didn't expect? Is his life destroyed by this? Is there more to his story, in the same way that there has been for this other character that I've been researching?
Yeah, I'm just one of the key things that you said there I want to bring forward is about how you use the court case, but then you went to the newspapers as well. And I think it's so important to do that. As soon as you're researching anybody and they're involved in some kind of a crime or they show up in the criminal records, absolutely go to the newspapers as well, because the newspapers are going to give you a lot more of a colorful story too. Maybe sometimes a little embellished just to sell more papers. But they will, the crime records, I mean, are so useful as well, but they are very straightforward. You've got name, a date, and place, and things like that. But the newspapers really kind of bring the story to life. And then you can also follow a bit more about what happened before and after, and get the full story of it. So I think it's great to always link court and newspapers together, no matter what. I think the other thing that you mentioned is when you start searching more about the crime and the other people involved in the crime, I've definitely gone down that rabbit hole as well, where you find somebody was a victim, but then you look up their name and they were a perpetrator of a crime at another time. And then you start seeing all of these interconnected web almost of criminal or victim or, back and forth. And it tells more of a story about what is the relationship with all these people, even though again, this is somebody that, these people might not all be in the same tree or in the same family, but there's definitely a relationship going on there because they know each other, and these kind of incidents keep coming up.
Oh, exactly. I mean, I can't emphasize what you're saying strongly enough. These webs of networks and relationships are the relationships in which people lived their daily lives and the connections they had to people. It could, this is one instance where it could be that the actual biological network of people to siblings and parents and grandparents is actually less strong and less important and less significant in their lives than the networks that we can reconstruct by looking at these newspaper cases and looking at the trials and looking at other records of interpersonal relationships. At some point, my office is going to look like one of those Scandi noir film TV series with like the crime board linking everybody up. I had a student do exactly that actually for a case in the 20s.
Oh, well, yeah, I can see myself doing that at some point as well. I want to just go to the comments here. Annie asked the question, would a woman have been as likely to have been charged as men? Would they likely be in the newspapers too? And I guess, Annie, it really would depend on the crime that we're talking about whether she would be charged or not. I guess there would be lower cases of women being charged of crime in some areas. Justin, do you want to feed into this at all?
Yeah. If you're speaking about homosexual offenses specifically,
well, absolutely, yes.
It's really going to depend on the country. And in this country, female homosexual offenses were never criminalized. There was discussion in the House of Lords in 1920, 1921 to create a new offense of gross indecency between women to parallel the charge that had existed since 1885 of gross indecency between men, but it was never passed into law. So there would not be records of women for criminal trials in the same way that they exist for men in this country. That's not the case in other countries. In other countries, sometimes female same-sex acts were criminalized, and there would be records of those, just depending on the specificities of the case. So that's again where it comes down to context and what Mary was saying earlier about knowing the law and knowing the situation in a particular country. That's not to say that you can't also do lesbian histories through family history techniques. It's just that certain sources will reveal particular stories and particular information differently for men and for women, or for those assigned female at birth and those assigned male at birth. Because of course, we might also be interested in thinking about non-binary people and trans people and what have you, and that's going to be imperfectly recorded, but not absent. Of course, the newspapers will talk about people who were masquerading as the other sex. So that's something where it might not be in a family tree, but the newspapers will record that kind of a crime, actually, where someone is found to be committing a fraud by presenting as in a way that doesn't align with the gender expectations placed upon them.
Absolutely. Annie's question there definitely brings to mind, this concept and this idea in the 17th and 18th century they call the female husband, where you have two women in a couple together, and one of the women passes as a man. Now, whether that means she might be passing as a man just due to economic reasons or safety reasons or anything like that, or maybe, you know, they were in fact transgender. We can't define that, and we can't label anybody like that, but we know these events happened, and they definitely would have been reported in the newspaper. And like you said, oftentimes came up as fraud, because they put their name down fraudulently. And on maybe there was a case where a couple, they were landlords of a pub as Mr. and Mrs., and it turned out it was actually two women. More questions coming in, and thank you so much everybody for joining. We have a lot of viewers today, and a lot of questions coming through, so we're going to try and keep up with these. We have Dominic says, which is a great point, women who live together are often called or assumed to be friends. And I think, Dominic, that's a great point about labeling people. We see often in the census that we have, you know, two people of the same sex living in a house together, and either, you know, they both might be labeled as single, but you know, if they're in the same house together, maybe repeatedly, you can start to make some assumptions, but I'm always very wary of really labeling a relationship. But I think it's important to identify a relationship is there, that these two people meant a lot to each other, but what exactly, how do they define it together? I think, you know, sometimes is, you know, maybe better left unsaid, because there's only so far you can go. With that, I don't know, Justin, what do you think sometimes about looking into these relationships in the past?
I agree, because people's relationships vary in the past across time and across space, and certainly friends listed in some way or identified some way can be simply friends or can be friends. So you need that corroborating evidence. You need that other evidence. I think it opens up really exciting and interesting questions that you want to look into other sources for. I've used wills, for instance, and it's really interesting to see how people might leave parts of their estate to friends and then might more suggestively describe the relationship. But there's all kinds of ways in which people live together in long-term, stable, emotionally invested relationships that are not necessarily gay or lesbian, but they're still interesting to us as queer historians, because they do show how people may have lived in ways that were not non-normative, that they weren't the usual, they didn't fit expectations, they might have transgressed in those ways even if they weren't sexual. So I think those kinds of relationships are still interesting to me as part of a wider history, but we also have to bear in mind that those relationships mean different things to different people, and we can't just automatically assign them to a category that's more familiar or comfortable to us.
I think, yeah, we've touched back to the point that we said before about the range of records. Don't limit yourself to just the one. So Kelly had asked about a single female ancestor she had living with an older single female, but on the census, they're listed as companions. Could this just be friendship, or could this be more? And I don't have an answer for that, whether it could be friendship or more. It could, you know, it could be both. But I think, you know, Justin, what you said there about wills, you know, if you can, Kelly, look at more records. If there is a will, you know, how did they describe the relationship? Did they leave anything to each other? I found, you know, situations where two women lived together and, you know, they were both listed as single, but then like they were buried together. And well, that's quite an extreme commitment there. And, you know, it tells you a lot more about the intensity of the relationship then at that point. So I would say to Kelly, kind of dig a little bit further, but the fact that they were companions still means that they still have a, you know, a true relationship with each other as well. I think we've got a few more comments coming in, but Justin, I wanted to go back to your research and maybe look further into some of the newspapers that you found. So this one is the Western Daily Press.
Sure, and I think this is still from the same case, and I think this one just illuminated a bit more. It just goes to show that one newspaper article is not necessarily going to tell you everything, and it's really great if you can find out more. And this was, well, obviously this was considered a big enough case in 1933 that it was reported fairly widely across a number of papers, and so the coverage isn't always. I mean, sometimes you'll find that the coverage is just cut and paste; they just repeated in the provincial papers what was published here in London, but other times there's going to be other information that appears. In this case, I don't remember exactly from newspaper to newspaper what was discussed, but Chapman was originally from Wiltshire, and so it might have been that a local paper would have taken a greater interest in the story and would have added to it. So it is, I mean, this is the historian's craft: get as many sources as you can and compare them and see if they're in conflict, if they're adding to each other, if they're giving more, and certainly look at multiple sources. And in this one, so for instance, in the previous one, I think it gave me his address and I knew where he lived and some information about that. Here I'm seeing him described as an actor. So there's you start to get more and more information, and that picture from starting off really fuzzy and blurry starts to come a little bit more into focus about a person's life. But it really is about the variety of sources, and not just across different types of sources, but in this case of newspapers, multiple articles from different publications.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that even though the articles look so similar, they might just have that tiny little nugget of detail that you need to get the story even further, or to trace them, trace their family back even more. Like you said, one might just be about the case and the next one's about the case, but then it includes that little bit of an address in it. And it's just like those little pieces of information are just like those amazing aha moments of being able to like, oh yes, I can add more, and now I can find their house and the electoral rolls, and then just keep going deeper than at that point.
Exactly. Well, and then in that case too, when you're finding the electoral rolls, if you find someone in a case, they're in a homosexual offense trial, and then you find out where they live, and maybe in the census you see actually who else is living at that address, and you might then find evidence of that relationship in their home that's different from that's recorded in the papers. So it just, every little step opens up new possibilities to you, and you're absolutely right. There's all these exciting aha moments.
And then I wanted to jump onto the 1911 census. So you found Sydney again here in the census.
Exactly, and I think this was in relationship to the newspapers. First, I found the newspapers, and there was a few people under this name in the census that wasn't necessarily the most helpful to me. But through the papers, I knew then that he was from Wiltshire, and so then, okay, if it's the Sydney Chapman in Wiltshire from this birth range, then I know this is the family. So it is about using sources in combination with each other to narrow things down. And certainly, of course, I mean, genealogists and family history experts know about these things, but I think it's a great reminder to us professional historians that haven't always taken family history methods as seriously as we should, just how much you can do and just how much you can narrow in and find out more about them. So I'm currently in the process of trying to dig up more about Chapman and a little bit about his family in that context. But having this confirmation of precisely where he is in the census and when he was born, rather than just when he was tried, then allowed me to confirm with later records if it says, oh, this Sydney Chapman that was born at this date versus born at this date. Because I did at one point think that I had trouble in that looking up Chapman. I found later records that suggested Sydney J. Chapman in the 30s or 40s was working in automobile sales in Shoreditch and was married to a woman. And I thought, oh, this is really fascinating. This guy is in several homosexual offense trials in the 30s, but by the later 40s, he's married with a child. And I'm like, this is a really interesting story that shows you how complicated queer history is. And then once I found the census and knew when he was born, I knew it wasn't that guy. And in fact, later on, I discovered Chapman, not for the trial that I was researching, but for that first one with Mr. X, was imprisoned at Wandsworth, I think, and at like, I mean, it's tragic. At like 24, he died in prison. I'm trying to dig up more on that, because to go from being, as far as I know, a healthy and active 20-something-year-old in the 1930s to being dead a couple of years later in prison after having been charged and convicted for homosexual offenses also really puts alarm bells in my head. I wonder what happened to him in prison. How did he die? What's going on here? Because it doesn't feel like a natural death.
Wow, that's a devastating story. Absolutely, it would be interesting to dig more to understand what happened there. But it's sad how quickly that can change. That you can see that happen from the conviction to the death as well. So it's definitely an unfortunate story. And, unfortunately, when you are looking, particularly for, looking at homosexual men, because of the court records, these are the stories you're going to come up with, because men were persecuted. Like you said earlier, that but women were not. Women didn't have any legislation against them in the UK. I think so. There's a few more comments coming through. Somebody went back to talking about the census records again and saying, I have female relatives. They were sisters that were teachers and were not allowed to get married. In the census, they were often found living together. So this was from Hazel, and absolutely, I've come across this repeatedly as well. There's a whole long history of, women, single professional women living together, and mainly for a lot of time is for economic reasons, because once, and particularly for teachers, because of course, once you got married, you had to leave your profession. So women often did stay single longer, and, cohabitated. And again, I think this is another case where it's, well, particularly these are two sisters, of course, but then you will find other, non-related women living together, and mainly to keep their professional status. So, sorry, Justin, I guess if we'll go on to the next record. You wanted to talk about the passenger list and what you found there. That was a really interesting story that you find here.
No, absolutely. And this is actually now looking at the older man in that case I was talking about. So now we know that Sidney Chapman was sent to prison, died in prison. The partner in the offense was this other man listed. His name is Patrickbainon, and he's the one whose family I discovered, and they've been generous in sharing their family records, and so I have access to a lot more background evidence to corroborate all of these things. But it was really interesting that in reviewing, actually ahead of our talk, in reviewing what was available, I saw the passenger lists, or saw one of either a hint or something that came up in the in searching for his name was a passenger list for a voyage in 1936, I think it is. And what was really interesting to me there is that he was going to Tangier. And this is again where context matters. I know that in this period, Tangier is, for those who can go, a bit of for lack of a better word, a gay destination. And that it was quite bohemian, especially for elites. There was a lot of opportunities for same-sex contact. And it immediately tweaked my curiosity. I'm like, okay, you've been charged for homosexual offenses. You've been found innocent. I should say the family says, of course he was guilty. He might have been found innocent, but of course he was guilty. And now I find you 3 years later off to Tangier on this is especially fascinating. And it's the passenger lists that tell me that. I would not necessarily have known that otherwise. And now I'm actually in the process of speaking with the family to build up that story, and finding out what he was doing there, what was going on. In the same way, actually, I had found that this man's wife was on a passenger list to Sri Lanka. I suppose Ceylon at the time, just before the trial. And she and it was her biological daughter, his stepdaughter, they went to Colombo in 1933 before the trial. And I have to believe that it was things were getting hot in England. And they had, I believe a brother was working there managing a tea plantation. And so she took some time away to get completely away from this scandal that was surrounding her and her family in London, and have a break. I think in the end she came back and testified in his defense, but for a while she got out of town, and I don't blame her. But it's the passenger records that help fill out that story, and it's not hard to imagine the stresses that she was under that encouraged her toward that action.
Yeah, that's amazing to find and be able to piece that whole story together. It would be so easy to just narrowly just look at what was happening in the court case, but then to hear, this other thing was happening with the family and the wife as well. It's incredible, the stories that you've been able to piece together. I'm interested in Tangier. Have you been able to do much research there? Do you know anything about records from that area?
I don't know about the records, but I'm really intrigued. By sheer coincidence, I've been reading a fair bit on Morocco over the last year, and so this I now know the hotel that he stayed at. I've uncovered other information about his voyage. I'd love to go and do some research there. It's definitely for a future project. I've been to Morocco a few times myself, and am just really fascinated with that international angle to queer lives in the 1930s, because I don't think a lot of people are aware of this kind of transnational, international, travel-based culture that was available to some privileged, more elite, especially queer white men, to participate in. And I think it tells a really interesting story. What I've since discovered is that he was there because his brother lived there and was in hospital, and they didn't know he'd live. But there's just so many questions about what else was going on at the same time. And I'm pouring through the family letters now to see what else is going on. And there's people named in those letters that I'm trying to trace and find out more about.
Yeah, I love the international context, and that's such a great point to look wider as well. It's just I'm just bringing to mind somebody had mentioned in the comments here about when we were speaking about laws against homosexual men, and Annie had mentioned about reading Oscar Wilde's accounts of his time in prison, but of course afterwards he went to Paris, and it's also reminding me of like James Baldwin's novel Giovanni's Room, and that's all set Americans in Paris, and you know, this idea of getting away and actually living somewhere else. So that's, you know, I guess that's another clue to kind of look at, you know, if your ancestor, you know, the uncle or the aunt, you know, moved away and into an area, and look at the history of that area, like you've brought up about Tangier, and to understand what was the lifestyle like there, what would it be that would draw that person to live there, and to understand a bit more. That's fascinating.
Absolutely. And with the case of Paris, actually, that's a really great example for lesbian histories. There was a really important lesbian subculture in Paris in the 20s and 30s, especially. Berlin is another city, of course, that had an incredible queer culture before the rise of the Nazis. For an earlier period, southern Italy. Oscar Wilde went on a tour of southern Italy, and Sicily was especially known as a queer destination for wealthy gay men, or wealthy queer men. Taormina is especially famous as a city in that regard, but Naples as well. These are just the European destinations that I can think of. There's going to be others in other contexts that are significant. And once you sort of know that context, and if you see a name of a certain city or a certain place, sort of little bells go off.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So Sherry is watching at the moment, and she commented that each family has twists and turns within its history. I believe it is fun to uncover the secrets of my family. I do have to say, we are a little boring so far, so that's a shame, Sherry. Hopefully you find some more of these twists and turns. Check these passenger lists, see if somebody ran off at some point and then came back later.
Well, and you never know who's boring and isn't. I mean, you know, Mary, about the story of my great uncle Cecil, who was just known as the family bachelor all his life and worked on a farm. And it's, 40, 50 years after he died, I inherited a little, actually, I should have had it out. It's literally across the room. I inherited from another relative a little cigarette tin that belonged to my bachelor great uncle that I'd never met. He died before I was born. And inside of it were a picture of a brother of his that died in childhood, a child's marble, and a bunch of gentleman friend pictures that are mostly unlabeled, including one that's my absolute favorite is a Mountie. I'm Canadian, a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. Sort of, I call him the sultry Mountie. He's leaning back against a railing with his hips out and bedroom eyes.
Yeah, I think, I mean, as much as, you know, we want to say we don't want to label too much, but yeah, if you find, you know, if you find your ancestor had a whole picture of these, you know, very good-looking men. You can make your own assumptions there. I think, and men in uniform, especially. Right? Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, there's a whole history of sailors we could get into. I think that's a whole another conversation for a different day. Yeah. I just want to finish off on the passenger list because Justin, I know you had one more record that you wanted to show as well, and this one's from going to Tangier too.
Sure.
David. Oh, did it switch over? So it's
Oh,
David
it is. Oh,
Bringley.
sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. The wonderful thing about these passenger lists too is, in addition to just finding my guy and knowing that he traveled, and I could see everybody else that disembarked from that at that destination. So on that ship from Tangier, I suppose I can see who else was on the ship going to other places as well, but I've not pursued that yet. And so when I knew that my guy was going to Tangier, I'm like, who else is going to Tangier if I already know that this is a suspect destination? And even just with a bit of Google searching, I started looking up others, and there were two men, David Brinley, whose record is shown here, and Norman Notley, who is lower down on the record. And through literally 5 minutes of Google searching, I found that there was photographs of them in the National Portrait Gallery, and that they were known as a queer couple in the 1930s. They lived, I think, until the 70s and 80s. So I suppose a gay couple, I suppose by that point they would self-identify as, but they were already in a committed partnership by this time. I'm trying to figure out still if this is just a fun coincidence, or if they knew my guy, and if there's any, if I'm starting to see a social network that might be emerging here. I'm trying to see who's listed in the letters. I mean, when I went back to the family letters and it was talking all about how sick Norman was, I'm like, oh, how this, like, what are the chances? Surely Norman, who's in the letters and is sick, is Norman who disembarked on the same day from the same ship. Alas, I was wrong. Actually, what I should say too is it got even better. I had a whole narrative in my head that my guy went to Tangier, Norman and David are with him, they're off, they're like doing the gay holiday circa 1936. Norman falls ill, the letters back home to his wife are Norman might die, Norman is very sick, we're very worried about Norman. I'm like, she knows about this? Of course she knows about this. She knew about his trial. Then he's talking about, well, we just can't contain Mary. Mary is being really difficult. And I'm like, Mary? Who's Mary? I'm like, maybe this is camp. Maybe he's talking about David Brinley and saying, you know, Mary, she just can't control herself. And it all fell apart when I went to the letters, because Norman is his brother and Mary is his sister-in-law. So it's not quite as queer as I hoped. But the fact that David and Norman are a confirmed queer couple in the 1930s on the same ship, getting off the same day in the same destination that itself is an interesting queer destination, requires more research, because my guy is doing more than just tending to his brother 24 hours a day. And what I'll probably do next is see whether this Norman Notley and David Brinley, whether their papers are deposited anywhere, and I'll see if there's records of their trip to Tangier, and if they discuss anyone or anything, or if they're at the same hotel for that matter.
I feel like at this point, even if it's not all true, you've got a great novel on your hands here. You're already putting together a fabulous story, So exactly. I think there's something you could do with this. One thing I want to mention is, you mentioned about Mary and the kind of the camp language, this kind of double language. Early, when we first start presenting, Victoria added a comment saying, I find the history of language used interesting across decades and generation. And I think it's really interesting to dig into the double language of LGBT history, of referring in these letters, even though you did eventually find out Mary is not a man, but is, a sister-in-law. But in letters, you do find that back and forth, men using, the name Mary, or even, in terms of lesbian relationships, she's Tommy sometimes, and these nicknames that are so common in a homosexual social circle.
No, absolutely. And if those letters are preserved, of course, many of them were proactively destroyed because they were damning, and because precisely because they'd be so valuable to us, they would show what those relationships are and what those networks are, and could actually bring other people into danger. So many of those letters were not saved, regrettably. And so this is the great loss to queer family history, is that any records that would have remained with the family could have been destroyed by the person who created or received them to protect themselves or others, or could have been destroyed by the family out of shame or danger or what have you. but when we do have them, they can illuminate so much. And those kinds of subcultural codes and those kinds of linguistic play and those kinds of nicknames and that kind of gender play all should be tweaking our curiosity and saying, why are they doing that? Why? What worlds of knowledge do they have access to, or what does this illuminate about the worlds in which they're circulating? The great example, of course, is for gay men in this period and up to the mid-century was a kind of secret code language called Polari. And I've not seen examples of that in written letters that I work with, but I know it exists. I mean, it would very, very rarely be written down. But if you see references to it, immediately that's a signal that we should be cottoning on. There's more going on. So I see that I see that in magazines from the mid-century where, or earlier for that matter, in the 1920s even, personal ads. There's all kinds of gay personal ads in the press, in the mainstream press, if you know what you're looking for. And they'll have that little signal, or they'll have strange combinations of things. So I look at personal ads in the 50s where it might say, single young bachelor interested in male friends. Okay, so far so good, right? Interested in wrestling and ballet. Picture wanted, reply to this, and just a little bit too many things in combination that you're like, buddy, I think I might know what you're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a comment here from Karen that says, a couple of years ago, I was at a workshop at the National Archives in London. It was about LGBT history research. It was really interesting. We were able to look at copies of a magazine called The Link. I don't know if you've come across this yet. And it was the Victorian equivalent of a dating site. We were able to read the original letters of communication between gay men and women after they answered the ads. And that newspaper, The Link, it used to be called Cupid's Messenger, and then it became The Link. It is actually available on Findmypast now. We digitized it last year, I think. We did it just in time for June for Pride Month. So it's available on Findmypast, but it's also available on the British Newspaper Archive. And over on the British Newspaper Archive, you can find a blog post specifically about the title and goes into a lot more detail about it as well. So just as soon as you said the classified ads, I saw this comment. I was like, that's just a perfect lineup there.
Oh yeah, and that's an amazing source. Actually, you would have been the workshop would have been surely held by Vicky Iglikowski-Broad, who's an absolutely amazing advocate of queer histories at the National Archives. And actually, I think that one of my MA students was at exactly the same event that you were, because my student then came back and was so engaged with The Link that they wrote a master's dissertation on it using family history research techniques and digging up the families of the men who were convicted in that case in the 20s, and found some of them and had access to their personal papers. And one of them wrote a whole family history. We discovered books written by one of the men that was convicted later in life. It basically everything I'm telling you that I'm doing with this case in the 30s, a student of mine has done with the Link case in the 20s. And I'm really pushing hard for that student to do a PhD and write a book on this, because I think it's so fascinating, so engaging, and so powerful a story to link this to individual lives and to follow those threads over generations. We discovered through exactly these records later relationships between men, families of choice, adoptions of children, wills, everything I'm talking about now. Absolutely.
And I can't wait for you to encourage your student to then come to us and write us a blog post or jump on Findmypast Live as well to talk about these discoveries. That sounds really, really interesting. I want to start wrapping up here, but we have a question. Ailey asks, my granddad's younger brother, born in Scotland, 1930, died around 1980, was rumored to be gay within our family. He seemed to travel regularly with other men, and they have lived together, possibly owned property together. Given this is relatively modern, do you have any tips for how I might be able to find out more, particularly about his maybe sexuality or a possible partner in records? So we're talking 1930s to 1980 then. So, I mean, my first thought would be, travel. We've already kind of touched on that point. Where were they traveling to? Understand a bit more about where they were going, about it, particularly at that time period. Where could you go at that time to maybe feel a bit more free, have a bit more freedom and liberty if you were in fact a gay man? And then, Justin, I'll let you jump in then.
Sure. I mean, I would wonder also about their wider networks. Do you have any other names associated with them if they have a dominantly gay friendship network, or if there's others that you can link to them and learn more about them? It might not be that any record absolutely confirms their sexuality, but a sort of a preponderance of evidence could lead you to suspect more about their lives. And if they're living in this committed friendship, I mean, it could be that, as we discussed before, or it could be, this could actually be signaling a same-sex desire and a gay relationship. I also think if you know where they lived and they were living together, I suppose if you need to confirm that, I've gone into land registry records, who owned properties at certain times. Those are available for. I don't think they're digitized yet, but they're purchasable quite affordably. I've done that when I've looked at people. Wills, again, how do they discuss each other in their wills, if you have access to that? What else? Those are the main things. I mean, going back to what Mary was talking about before, where are they buried? Are they buried together? I mean, that says something as well. It's all of these things taken together. And I suppose if you have any access to family records or personal records, search their names in the databases, see if they were ever recorded in the papers for having been charged for anything, if they appeared in any way in that way. And it's actually surprising how many of us do appear in the press over a lifetime of incidents. And sometimes it's just recording a school event or I mean, court cases are obviously the most rich and interesting in some ways, but other things can help you put a picture together. I'm researching someone else. I feel like I'm just stalking a whole series of gay men from the 50s. I'm researching someone else that also, this one appeared through a series of letters rather than a trial. But when I but when I searched him in the newspaper database records, searched for his name, I found that he was actually, say 10, 20, 30 years before I'm interested in him, he was boarding with a famous silent film actress and was accused of stealing her clothes. And I mean, that on its own is odd. And not necessarily damning, but when taken all together, it's very interesting that he was stealing her dresses. It got into the papers because she was notorious not only she was famous as a film actress and notorious as a very public drug addict, and that was reported on in the press. So he actually had a small part to play in that case, but appeared nonetheless. And he was just an ordinary art teacher by the 1950s, and in fact had this record that his contemporaries in the 50s would never have found, and I can find it in a few keystrokes.
I think besides even the novel, I think now we're writing a mini series too, with the amount of stories you can pull together. I think I just actually another source that's popped in my head for Ellie's question, but particularly because of the time period, 1930s to 1980s, is activism. Particularly, a lot of local areas will have, queer archives. National libraries have queer archives and catalogs that you can look into, and would have records of the early liberation movements from the 60s and the 70s and onwards. And even though, hopefully, post-COVID times, you can go into these places and dig through kind of these boxes, and a lot of times you'll find reports from monthly meetings and membership lists, and even just their own kind of magazine or zine that they created to talk about what they're doing. So I would, if you even have a history, an interest in gay history, it's fun to look through those boxes anyway, and you never know, you might actually come across your ancestor's name in the middle of this membership list, or even as a photo, like you said in the newspapers, maybe as a photo at a gay liberation march, and could be captioned. So you don't know where they're going to come up. We've had a few other comments here. So one person said, just a thought, could we have a session on some people from history who were gay and bisexual? So just a general history kind of session about people. And I want to point out that Findmypast has been putting out some blogs recently about LGBT people from history. Another comment here mentioned they would like to it was Graham here, mentioned they'd like to know more about queer icons of the 18th century, like Mother Clap and Princess Seraphina. So Mother Clap, of course, is known for being kind of the landlord, basically, of what used to be called the Molly Clubs, which were 18th century gay bars. And were often raided, of course, and you can find out more about them in the newspapers, particularly from the raids. And I do know over at the British Newspaper Archive there is a blog post about the Molly Clubs if you wanna check out more. But I think this lends onto quickly, Justin, some of the other work that you're doing. So with Historic England Pride of Place project.
Mm-hmm. And actually, we have Mother Clap's Molly House listed on the Pride of Place map, so it's a great segue. And actually, I think we have Princess Seraphina as well. I think Princess Seraphina had lived near the Aldwych in an area that's now destroyed, but not far, either at the Aldwych or just further down the Strand. I remember doing a walking tour that I was giving to students, and I double checked that at the time. But all of this is on the Pride of Place map. So Pride of Place is a project that I was involved in with Professor Alison Oram, who was then at Leeds Beckett University, to map locations of LGBTQ history and heritage from the dawn of time until the present. And actually, we've got locations from Roman Britain to the present that have been mapped on this this project that was led by Historic England. And it is crowdsourced. It's interactive. You can go, if you search Pride of Place and History Pin, which is the platform on which it is, you should be able to find the map. And it's currently restricted to England because it was funded by Historic England. But it is a great opening into so many histories and so many stories, because part of it is us as historical experts putting in places that we know and have researched or have uncovered in other people's research, places like Mother Clap's Molly House, which was in Holborn, actually, and others going further back into the more distant past. But it also included people telling their own stories, or stories about their own families or their own experiences. And it could be something about recording a relationship, a marriage. It could be talking about an example of activism or violence that they encountered, but it can be ordinary things too. It could be talking about people they knew. It could be talking. One of my favorites was a trans person who identified a Next clothing shop in Leeds and said, this is the first place I ever bought clothing that matched my gender identity. I think that's a really important part of social history. I can't link it to a name. I can't link it to a date. I mean, I know roughly, I suppose, the period very, very roughly, and it's not, that's the kind of thing that's so profoundly important to queer historians and to our social and cultural history, but it's not recorded in any official document anywhere. So we really think of the Pride of Place map as both an opportunity to share information and to add your own stories or to learn about others' stories, and to learn about the past, but also to create an archive for the future of the kinds of stories, lives, and experiences that just don't make it into the records.
That's amazing. I love those really personal stories that you're able to discover through that. And I think, again, going back to one of our first points, the range of records, jump out of the family history sphere as well. Look at these local archives, look at these gay activist sites. Carrie Ann mentioned the Bishopsgate Institute in London has an amazing LGBT collection, but then also this Pride of Place project as well, to understand a lot more and get a lot more context too. So I think we're at like the top of the hour. I think we're going to have to start wrapping up. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We've had like over 100 people viewing today. So thank you so much for bringing in all your comments. I am sorry we haven't been able to answer every question and highlight everybody that was here, but we really appreciate the engagement. I am going to go into the comments afterwards. I'm going to add some links to some of the things that we've talked about, like the blog posts and Pride of Place history project as well. But Justin, any other final thoughts you wanted to pass on?
I think just I guess my excitement and enthusiasm for this incredible range of sources is, I hope it's contagious. Well, I guess I'm preaching to the choir, really, aren't I? I think I am with the group that are joining us today, and certainly with you, Mary. And it's just, I mean, just to reiterate how valuable family history methods are to queer history. And even though the linkages might not at first seem obvious, actually queer people, just like all people, leave a whole range of records that are increasingly available to us. And the digitization of these records has, I mean, I suppose I've been professionally a historian for a decade or two, and just in that time, just in the last few, it feels like every few years, access to new records revolutionizes what I can do and what I can research and what I can access, and it's overwhelming the possible stories that are out there. So all of these stories that I shared with you that could be now a series of mini-series, a Netflix special of queer lives, is so much more easily accessible. This research would have been well nigh impossible to do not that long ago.
And of course, now I have to plug that, Findmypast is the only site that releases new records every single week. So always come back and search more, and keep searching for that. Again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Justin, thank you for being so generous with your time. I have a feeling with some of these comments, we're going to have be asked to bring you back again. So thank you very much. Everybody at home, thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.